Good morning, folks. Welcome to another of our daily devotions. We're in the 22nd Psalm again. I'd encourage you to read from verse 9 onwards. Whenever we go through troubles and trials of any kind, while that particular trouble lasts, our mood, our feelings, they often rise and fall. There are times when the trouble we are facing are like huge waves that submerge us in fear and doubt, sorrow, anxiety, and all those distressing feelings that are associated with trouble. At such times, our faith finds it hard to get any solid footing in the quicksand of despair. However, at other times, when, to continue the analogy, our feet discover a solid shelf of rock on which we are able to stand, and for a while we find that we're no longer sinking, but in fact beginning by faith to push out of the pit of despair. That is what is happening in the experience of the psalmist in Psalm 22. In verses 9 to 11, the psalmist's faith and hope begin to reassert themselves. He once again takes his eyes off the circumstances he's in, off those who are attacking him, and he instead fixes his eyes on God. He reminds himself of how God had cared for him in the past, even from the very day of his birth. Yes, of course, his parents cared for him and they gave him the sense of security that he needed as a child when he was so helpless and so vulnerable. But even behind the care of his parents, the psalmist acknowledges God's protecting care at work. God was watching over him. Looking back, he can say, "You have been my God since I was born." It's as though he's saying to God, "You have been watching over me and caring for me every day since I was born." And then the inference flowing from that is God would continue to care for him, to be with him, to help him, even when there was no one else to help him. Because as he says, far from helping him, everyone else is against him. And it's that thought that moves the psalmist then to think again about his enemies, those being against him. He says he feels like he's completely surrounded by vicious, strong bulls. Bulls that are ready to run at him and gore him. Escape is impossible because he's completely surrounded. And then he changes the picture by describing his enemies next as ravenous lions that are ready to devour him. They're out for their prey, ready to pounce. This naturally makes him feel completely helpless. And so in verse 14 he says, "I am poured out like water." He goes on to speak about the deep agony he feels in his soul. And what he describes in physical terms. He says, "It's as though my bones are all out of joint." I remember whenever I dislocated my shoulder working up in the Carrickfergus building. It was one of the most painful experiences that I have ever had. Absolute agony. The psalmist knew what it was to have his bones out of joint. He feels as though death is near. He says, "Into the dust of death thou hast led me." In verse 17, he speaks of being able to count his bones. He's skeletal-like, probably as a result of not eating properly while all of this is being going on. We know that's what happens. We go off our food. In extreme cases of distress and trial, we lose our appetite and we lose weight. He feels he can do nothing about what's happening himself. He cannot escape from these men. There's only one thing he can do, and that's call out again to God. And as we're going to see in our next study, that's exactly what he does. So what do these verses teach us? Well, friends, there will be times in your life, as there have been times in my life, when we will have to face periods of really severe trials, circumstances that bring us as low as the psalmist, circumstances from which we might at the time feel we cannot escape. Well, take heart. Take heart. God has not forgotten you. Lift your eyes from the circumstances and try to focus them on God. This psalm, as you know, is a psalm that very clearly points to the experience of our Saviour. Our Saviour on the cross knew the depths of all the experiences which the psalmist speaks of here. In fact, his experience was even more extreme than the psalmist. And in his extremity, in the Saviour's extremity, where did his hope find a solid footing? His hope was firmly rooted in God his Father. And that's where our hope in the midst of trials must always lie. In our next study, we'll see that despite all the despair of this psalm, it moves into a much brighter period and a glorious end. Every blessing today, folks.